The morning mist hung low over Lake Cascade, where a weathered fishing boat gently rocked against its moorings. Its owner, Mike Harrison, a heavyset man with graying hair and calloused hands, appeared to be nothing more than another local retiree enjoying his golden years on the water. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath his unassuming exterior lay 20 years of Naval Special Warfare experience and a set of skills that would soon make a group of cartel members deeply regret their choice of target. The early autumn air carried a slight chill as Mike made his way down the wooden dock, his boots creating hollow echoes with each step. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was just beginning to peek over the eastern mountains, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and pink. This daily ritual of checking his beloved boat, Second Wind, had become as natural as breathing since he'd retired from the Navy SEALs 3 years ago. The lake had become his sanctuary, a place where the memories of countless missions and the weight of his service could fade into the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Mike noticed something was wrong before he even reached his slip. 20 years of operating in the world's most dangerous environments had given him a sixth sense for danger, an instinct that had kept him alive through countless operations. The dock felt different this morning. There were subtle marks on the wooden planks, signs of activity from the previous night that shouldn't have been there. His boat, a 28-foot fishing vessel he'd spent the last 2 years restoring, was sitting slightly lower in the water than usual. As he approached, his trained eyes picked up more details. Scuff marks on the gunnel, a rope that had been retied with a different knot, and most tellingly, the familiar weight of being watched. Mike maintained his casual demeanor, continuing his approach as if he hadn't noticed anything amiss. Inside, however, his mind was already cycling through tactical assessments, counting exits, and cataloging potential threats. The lake was quiet this early, most of the other boat owners still asleep in their lakeside homes. Only a few early morning birds broke the silence with their distant calls. Mike reached into his jacket pocket, feeling the reassuring weight of his phone. His other hand, calloused from years of handling weapons and climbing ropes, instinctively checked for his concealed carry, a habit he'd never quite shaken. As he reached the boat, movement caught his eye, a shadow shifting below deck. Mike's muscles tensed, but his face remained impassive. He'd seen enough combat to know that revealing what you know too early can cost you the advantage. Instead, he kept up his appearance as an ordinary retiree, reaching down to check the mooring lines as if it were any other morning. The sound of hushed voices speaking Spanish drifted up from below deck, confirming his suspicions. Based on the acoustics, he estimated 3, maybe 4 individuals. Their accents were distinct, mainland Mexican, likely from one of the cartels, that had been pushing their operations north into Idaho's remote lakes and forests. They'd been using the waterways to move product, taking advantage of the area's sparse law enforcement presence. Mike's mind flashed back to a briefing he'd received just before retiring, warning about increased cartel activity in the Pacific Northwest. They'd been hijacking boats, using them for single runs before abandoning them, but they'd picked the wrong vessel this time. Second Wind wasn't just any boat. It was his home away from home, the place where he'd finally found peace after 2 decades of war. He straightened up, making a show of stretching his back as he surveyed the lake. The morning mist provided good cover, and the early hour meant few witnesses. That could work both for and against him. His years of training had taught him that the element of surprise was often better than superior numbers, and right now, these cartel members had no idea who they were dealing with. The decision crystallized in his mind. He couldn't let them take his boat, not just because it was his property, but because he knew exactly what they'd use it for. Too many communities had been poisoned by their operations, too many lives destroyed by their trade. As he stood on the dock, formulating his approach, Mike felt a familiar calm settle over him. It was the same feeling he'd experienced before. Every mission, a clarity of purpose that pushed aside all doubt and hesitation. A slight creaking sound from below deck indicated movement. They were preparing to make their move, probably waiting for him to leave so they could take the boat out under cover of the morning mist. But Mike Harrison hadn't spent 20 years as a Navy SEAL to walk away from a fight, especially not when it had come right to his doorstep. These cartel members were about to learn a very expensive lesson about choosing their targets more carefully. Mike moved with deliberate slowness, maintaining his cover as he stepped onto his boat. Each movement was calculated, his weight distributed evenly to minimize the sound of his footsteps on the deck. The morning mist continued to roll across Lake Cascade, providing a natural screen that would work to his advantage. His years of training had taught him that patience was often the difference between success and failure. The voices below deck grew quieter as he moved across the boat, but he could still make out fragments of their conversation. They were discussing departure times, routes, and drop points, standard cartel logistics. Mike's Spanish, honed through joint operations in Central and South America, was more than adequate to understand their plans. They intended to take his boat north, using the network of rivers and lakes that stretched up toward Canada. As he pretended to check his fishing equipment, arranged neatly along the starboard side, Mike took stock of his situation. His trained eye had already spotted several signs of forced entry, scratches around the cabin lock, a partially bent rail where they'd climbed aboard, and muddy boot prints they'd failed to clean. These weren't professionals, at least not the kind he was used to dealing with. They were muscle, sent to acquire transportation, with little concern for subtlety. The sound of a safety being quietly clicked off echoed from below deck. Mike's muscles tensed imperceptibly, but his outward appearance remained unchanged. That sound brought back memories of countless operations, of dark nights in foreign territories where the smallest noise could mean the difference between life and death. He knew they were preparing to make their move, probably thinking they had the advantage of surprise. A floorboard creaked behind him, and Mike could sense someone emerging from the cabin. He continued to fiddle with his fishing rods, playing the role of the oblivious retiree while his mind mapped out the positions of everyone on board. 3 distinct breathing patterns below deck, 1 person behind him, and based on the shadow cast by the rising sun, another individual was positioning themselves near the port side. "Don't move, senor," a voice commanded in heavily accented English. "We don't want trouble. Just walk away from the boat." Mike raised his hands slowly, turning to face the speaker. The man was young, probably in his mid-20s, holding a pistol with the uncertain grip of someone more used to intimidation than actual combat. Behind him, another cartel member emerged from below deck, followed by 2 more. All armed, all trying to project an air of menace that Mike had seen too, many times before. The leader, distinguishable by his more expensive clothing and gold chain, stepped forward. "This is nothing personal," he said, gesturing with his weapon. "The boat is all we want. Walk away now, and there won't be any problems." Mike took in every detail as he maintained his passive stance. 4 men, all armed but holding their weapons incorrectly. Their stance and positioning showed no tactical training. They had spread out across the deck, but in doing so, they'd created clear lines of fire that could work against them. Most importantly, none of them had bothered to check him for weapons. "Look," Mike said, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen far worse situations. "I'm just a retired guy who likes to fish. This boat is all I have." He let a slight tremor enter his voice, playing up the role of an intimidated civilian, while his mind calculated angles and distances. The leader laughed, a sound without humor. "Then retire somewhere else, old man. This is business, nothing personal." Mike noticed how the others had relaxed slightly, buying into his performance as a helpless retiree. It was a mistake he'd seen countless targets make during his years of service, underestimating an opponent based on appearances. The morning sun had risen higher now, burning away some of the mist and casting long shadows across the deck. The lake remained quiet, the only sounds coming from distant birds and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. "You have 10 seconds to leave," the leader continued, his confidence growing with each word. "After that, we do this the hard way." Mike appeared to deflate, his shoulders sagging in apparent defeat. "Can I at least get my wallet from below deck? My ID is in there." The leader hesitated, then nodded to one of his men to accompany Mike. It was exactly the opening he'd been waiting for. These men had made a series of critical mistakes. They'd chosen the wrong boat, underestimated its owner, and most fatally, they'd allowed him to dictate the next move. As Mike turned toward the cabin, his expression hidden from the cartel members. A familiar calm settled over him, the kind of calm that came before every major operation, every critical moment where training and instinct merged into decisive action. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mike descended the stairs into the cabin with measured steps, the armed cartel member following close behind. The familiar interior of his boat took on a different dimension now. Every surface, every corner represented a potential advantage. 20 years of special operations had taught him to turn any environment into a weapon, and his beloved second wind was about to become exactly that. The cabin showed signs of the cartel's presence. Maps spread across the small table, empty. Water bottles and cigarette butts carelessly left on the floor. They'd made themselves comfortable, assuming their temporary occupation would go unchallenged. Mike's jaw tightened imperceptibly at the disrespect shown to his vessel, but his exterior remained calm. The time for reaction would come soon enough. "Hurry up, old man," the cartel member behind him growled, prodding him with the barrel of his gun. The man's breath carried the scent of stale cigarettes and cheap tequila. His weapon handling was sloppy, the barrel occasionally drifting away from Mike's back, his stance unstable on the gently rocking boat. More tells that these weren't hardened professionals, just thugs with guns and too much confidence. Mike moved toward the small cabinet where he kept his personal belongings, his movements deliberately slow and uncertain. He could hear the other cartel members shifting on the deck above, their footsteps betraying their positions. The leader was near the stern. Two others spread across the port and starboard sides. Their positioning was amateur, leaving multiple blind spots and failing to maintain proper coverage. "It's in here somewhere," Mike mumbled, his hand reaching into the cabinet. The cartel member behind him sighed in irritation, taking half a step closer. It was the last mistake he would make. In one fluid motion, Mike grabbed the man's gun hand, simultaneously driving his elbow back into the thug's solar plexus. The thigh move, practiced countless times in combat situations, was executed with surgical precision. Before the man could react, Mike had already disarmed him, using the momentum to slam him face first into the cabin wall. The impact was carefully controlled, enough to stun, but not enough to alert those above. The cartel member slumped to the floor, unconscious, as Mike quickly secured his weapon. Above deck, the others continued their casual conversation, unaware that the dynamic had already shifted. Mike took a moment to center himself, falling back on his years of CQC, close quarters combat training. The cabin of his boat was tight, confined, but he knew every inch of it. This was his territory, and he was about to remind these intruders why that mattered. He checked the fallen man's weapon, a cheap 9mm with a full magazine. Not his preferred tool, but it would do. More importantly, he now had eyes on their operation. The maps they'd left out showed their planned route, along with several marked locations that were likely drop points for their drug-running operation. This wasn't just about his boat anymore. These people were using the waterways he'd come to love as a pipeline for their poison. Mike could hear the leader growing impatient above. "What's taking so long down there?" he called out in Spanish. "Jorge, get him moving." The moment of decision had arrived. Mike had multiple options, each with its own risks and advantages. He could try to take them by surprise one at a time, using the cabin as a choke point, or he could go for a more direct approach, using speed and violence of action to overwhelm them before they could organize an effective response. Both approaches had merit, but he needed to choose quickly. His mind raced through scenarios, calculating angles and timing. The morning sun would be in their eyes if they were facing the cabin entrance, giving him a slight advantage. The gentle rocking of the boat would affect their aim, especially given their obvious lack of maritime experience. Most importantly, they still thought they were dealing with a harmless retiree. Mike moved to the cabin steps, positioning himself for what would come next. His breathing slowed, his heart rate steady, the same state of controlled readiness he'd maintained through countless operations. He could feel the familiar surge of adrenaline, but his years of training had taught him to channel it, to use it without being controlled by it. "Jorge!" the leader called again, real anger entering his voice. "Answer me! Mike smiled grimly. These men had come to his sanctuary, threatened him on his own boat, and planned to use it for their criminal enterprise. They were about to learn why that had been a terrible mistake. His mind flashed back to his last mission as a SEAL, another operation where the enemy had underestimated their opposition. The results had been decisive then, just as they would be now. The leader's footsteps approached the cabin entrance, his shadow falling across the steps. "Jorge, I swear if you're sleeping down there." He began to descend, his weapon held casually at his side. Mike tensed, ready to move. The next few seconds would determine everything, and he intended to make them count. The tension in that moment was palpable, the calm before an inevitable storm. As the cartel leader's boots appeared on the top step of the cabin, time seemed to slow down. Mike's years of training had prepared him for moments exactly like this, when split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The morning sun filtered through the cabin entrance, creating long shadows that would work to his advantage. But before we continue with what happened next, this is the kind of story that needs to be shared. If you're enjoying this intense confrontation between a retired Navy SEAL and the cartel members who made the mistake of stealing his boat, make sure to hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications by clicking the bell icon. You won't want to miss our upcoming stories of ordinary people revealing extraordinary capabilities in the face of danger. Leave a comment below, telling us where you're watching from. Are you sitting on the edge of your seat wondering how Mike is going to handle these cartel members who have no idea what they're up against? Let us know your predictions for what happens next. Now, let's get back to that crucial moment on Lake Cascade, where a simple boat theft was about to turn into something these cartel members would never forget. The leader's descent into the cabin continued, each step bringing him closer to a confrontation he wasn't prepared for. The other cartel members remained above, their attention scattered, their guard down. They still believed they were dealing with a helpless retiree and his unconscious companion. That misconception was about to cost them dearly. Mike's mind raced through his options one final time. The confined space of the cabin would work both for and against him. The close quarters meant limited mobility, but it also meant his opponents couldn't bring their numbers to bear effectively. His intimate knowledge of every inch of his boat would prove crucial in the next few moments. The morning had started like any other on Lake Cascade, with mist rolling across the water and early birds calling in the distance. None of the lake's regular inhabitants could have guessed that this peaceful scene was about to erupt into the kind of conflict usually reserved for military operations. The cartel's decision to steal this particular boat was about to become a case study in poor target selection. Mike's muscles tensed as the leader reached the halfway point of the stairs. From this position, he could see the man's boots, the hem of his expensive jeans, and the casual way he held his weapon. The leader's overconfidence was evident in every movement, every step taken without proper tactical awareness. In his mind, he was simply checking on a subordinate who wasn't responding, perhaps dealing with an uncooperative old man. The other cartel members shifted position above deck, their shadows moving across the cabin entrance as they maintained their loose perimeter. Their voices had dropped to whispers, but their relaxed tone suggested they still hadn't realized anything was wrong. The element of surprise remained firmly in Mike's favor. 20 years in the SEALs had taught Mike the value of patience, of waiting for exactly the right moment to strike. He'd learned these lessons in some of the world's most dangerous places, where hesitation meant death and poor timing could compromise an entire mission. Now, on his own boat, those same lessons were about to be applied with devastating effect. The leader's descent brought him to the last few steps. From his position, he would be able to see Jorge's unconscious form in a matter of seconds. Mike's grip tightened imperceptibly on the captured weapon, his breathing steady and controlled. The familiar weight of the gun in his hand brought back memories of countless operations, of moments just like this where everything hung in the balance. Above deck, one of the cartel members laughed at some unheard joke, the sound carrying clearly through the cabin entrance. The morning breeze had picked up slightly, causing the boat to rock gently against its moorings. These small details registered in Mike's mind automatically, part of the heightened awareness that preceded combat. The leader reached the bottom step, his body beginning to turn toward where Jorge lay unconscious. In the next few seconds, everything would change. The peaceful morning on Lake Cascade was about to be shattered, and these cartel members were about to learn a harsh lesson about appearances being deceiving. The next phase of this confrontation would demonstrate why you should never judge a person's capabilities by their appearance, and why stealing a boat from a retired Navy SEAL was quite possibly the worst decision these men had ever made. As the leader's foot touched the cabin floor, Mike prepared to make his move. The next few moments would determine not just the fate of his beloved second wind, but potentially the future of the cartel's operations in the entire region. 2 decades of special operations experience were about to be unleashed in the confined space of a fishing boat's cabin, and nothing would ever be the same. The leader's foot had barely touched the cabin floor when Mike made his move. Years of combat experience compressed into a single fluid motion as he erupted from his position, crossing the small space with explosive speed. Before the cartel leader could register what was happening, Mike had already cleared the distance between them, his right hand clamping down on the man's gun hand, while his left delivered a precise strike to the throat. The leader's eyes widened in shock, his attempt to cry out reduced to a choked gasp. Mike used the man's momentum against him, spinning him around and driving him face first into the cabin wall with enough force to disorient but not enough to alert those above. The gun clattered to the floor as the leader's grip went slack, his consciousness fading from the precise application of pressure to his carotid artery. Mike lowered the unconscious body quietly to the floor, adding a second cartel member to the growing collection of mistakes they'd made. Above deck, the remaining 2 men continued their casual conversation, unaware that their situation had drastically changed. Their voices drifted down through the cabin entrance, discussing what they'd do with the money from their drug run. 20 years of special operations had taught Mike the value of momentum. He knew he had mere seconds before the others would become suspicious of the prolonged silence. His mind raced through scenarios as he retrieved the leader's dropped weapon, checking it with practiced efficiency. Unlike the cheap pistol their subordinate had carried, this was a high-end automatic. At least the leader had good taste in firearms. The confined space of the cabin worked to his advantage now. The remaining cartel members would have to come down the stairs one at a time, creating a natural choke point. Mike positioned himself accordingly, his movements silent despite his size. The familiar rush of adrenaline sharpened his senses, bringing every detail into crystal focus. "Hey boss," one of the men called down in Spanish. "Everything okay down there?" Mike responded in perfect Spanish, mimicking the leader's voice with the skill of someone who'd done similar deceptions during countless operations. "All clear? Come down and help with this old man's wallet." The response seemed to satisfy them. Footsteps approached the cabin entrance, and Mike could see the shadow of the next cartel member beginning his descent. Like his leaders before him, this man displayed no tactical awareness, his weapon held casually at his side as he navigated the steps. As the man reached the midpoint of the stairs, Mike made his decision. Rather than wait for another close-quarters engagement, he chose a more direct approach. In one explosive movement, he reached up, grabbed the man's ankle, and yanked hard. The cartel member tumbled forward with a surprised yelp, his weapon flying from his grip as he crashed down the remaining stairs. The sound of his falling comrade finally alerted the last man on deck. "What's happening down there?" he shouted, his voice tight with sudden concern. The element of complete surprise was gone, but Mike didn't need it anymore. He'd already shifted the odds dramatically in his favor. The fallen cartel member tried to scramble to his feet, but Mike was already on him. A quick strike to the solar plexus drove the air from his lungs, followed by a precise hit to the temple that sent him into unconsciousness. Above, the last man was shouting frantically, calling the names of his companions with increasing desperation. Mike retrieved the fallen man's weapon, adding it to his growing collection. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays streaming through the cabin entrance at an angle that would work to his advantage. He could hear the last cartel member moving across the deck, his footsteps betraying his panic. "Jorge! Jefe! Someone answer me!" The man's voice cracked with fear as he approached the cabin entrance, his shadow visible against the stairs. Unlike his companions, he at least had the sense to keep his weapon raised as he began his descent. Mike allowed himself a grim smile. In their arrogance, these men had walked into a situation they weren't prepared for. They'd seen an overweight, aging fisherman and assumed he would be an easy target. Now 3 of them were unconscious, and the last was about to learn why appearances could be deceiving. The final cartel member took the stairs slowly, his gun sweeping the space before him. It was a better approach than his companions had shown, but it came too late. Mike had already positioned himself perfectly, using the angles of the cabin and the morning light to his advantage. As the man's head cleared the entrance, the sun would be directly in his eyes, creating a crucial moment of vulnerability. Mike's muscles tensed as he prepared for his final move. The morning's peace had been shattered, but he was about to restore it, one way or another. These men had brought violence to his sanctuary, and now they would learn why that had been a terrible mistake. The last cartel member was about to discover that he wasn't just dealing with any retiree. He was facing a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the art of combat in the world's most elite fighting force. The final cartel member's boots appeared at the top of the stairs, his shadow stretching down into the cabin. Unlike his companions, he kept his weapon raised, moving with the caution of someone who knew something had gone terribly wrong. But caution wouldn't be enough to save him from what was coming. Mike had already calculated every angle, every possible movement, and had prepared accordingly. As the man's head cleared the entrance, the morning sun hit his eyes exactly as Mike had anticipated. In that crucial moment of blindness, Mike struck. He surged forward, using his considerable size with a speed that would have surprised anyone who'd dismissed him as just an overweight retiree. His hand clamped down on the man's gun, pushing it up and away while simultaneously driving his shoulder into the cartel member's midsection. The impact drove the breath from the man's lungs in an explosive gasp. Mike continued his momentum, lifting and throwing his opponent across the cabin with practiced efficiency. The cartel member crashed into the opposite wall, his weapon clattering away as he slumped to the floor. 4 down, all within the span of minutes, and Mike hadn't even broken a sweat. But as he secured the last weapon, his trained ears picked up a sound that changed everything: the distant purr of approaching boats. Through the cabin windows, he caught glimpses of 2 sleek vessels cutting through the morning mist. Their approach was too coordinated, too purposeful to be casual lake traffic. The cartel had backup, and they were coming in fast. Mike's mind shifted gears immediately, tactical assessment giving way to strategic planning. He quickly searched the unconscious cartel members, finding phones, extra ammunition, and a radio that crackled with urgent Spanish voices. The approaching boats were asking for status updates, their tone growing more suspicious with each unanswered call. Moving to the cabin's small window, Mike counted at least 6 armed men on each approaching vessel. These weren't the same caliber as the amateurs he'd just dealt with. Their movements and positioning showed actual tactical training. The stakes had just risen dramatically, and even with his extensive experience, taking on 12 trained gunmen would be pushing the limits. Mike quickly secured the unconscious cartel members with zip ties he kept in his emergency kit. 20 years of operations had taught him to always be prepared, and now that training was paying off. As he worked, his mind raced through options. The approaching boats would be within firing range in less than 2 minutes, and he needed a plan. The radio crackled again, more insistent this time. Eagle 1, respond. What's your status? The voice belonged to someone used to command, someone who expected immediate compliance. When no response came, the same voice barked orders to the approaching boats. Weapons hot. Prepare for hostile contact. Mike moved quickly through his boat, gathering what he needed. His beloved second wind might have started as a fishing vessel, but he'd made certain modifications during the restoration, additions that reflected his background and perpetual readiness for trouble. Behind a false panel in the galley, he retrieved a compact tactical vest and his personal sidearm, a custom Sig Sauer he'd carried through his last 3 years of service. The morning sun had burned away most of the mist now, leaving the lake's surface clear and bright. Through the windows, Mike could see the approaching boats had split up, moving to flank his position from both port and starboard. It was a solid, tactical approach, one that would have worked well against a normal civilian boat owner. But Mike Harrison was far from normal. He could hear the boat's engines throttling down as they took up position roughly 50 yards out. Their guns would be trained on second wind's cabin and deck, preparing for whatever resistance they might encounter. They still didn't know exactly what had happened to their advance team, but they were taking no chances. A voice boomed across the water, amplified by a megaphone. "This is your only warning. Come out with your hands up or we open fire." Mike Reese allowed himself a grim smile as he made final preparations. These men had brought cartel tactics to his sanctuary, threatening him on his own boat and planning to use these waters for their drug trade. Now they were about to learn why that had been a serious miscalculation. The cartel might have numbers and firepower on their side, but Mike had something better: decades of experience in exactly this type of asymmetric warfare. The radio crackled one final time. "You have 30 seconds to comply." Mike checked his weapon, settling the familiar weight of his tactical vest across his shoulders. The morning had started with 4 amateurs trying to steal his boat. Now it had escalated into a full-scale confrontation with cartel gunmen on Lake Cascade. But as the tension mounted and the countdown continued, Mike felt only a familiar calm. The cartel was about to learn that threatening a retired Navy SEAL on his own boat wasn't just a mistake. It was quite possibly the last mistake they would ever make. 20 seconds remained in the cartel's countdown as Mike moved through his final preparations. His mind flashed back to countless operations where similar situations had played out, being outnumbered, outgunned, but never outmatched. Second Wind might have looked like a simple fishing boat, but Mike had prepared it for exactly this type of situation, even if he'd hoped never to need such modifications. He quickly accessed a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's main berth, revealing a compact arsenal that would have surprised even the most thorough boat inspector. This wasn't just paranoia. His years of service had taught him that preparation often meant the difference between life and death. Among the equipment was a set of military-grade smoke grenades, flashbangs, and several other tactical devices he'd maintained from his service days. The cartel boats maintained their flanking positions, their engines idling as they waited for their ultimatum to expire. Through the cabin windows, Mike could make out their crew configurations: 4 men with automatic weapons on the port side boat, 5 on the starboard, and 3 more individuals who appeared to be commanding the operation. Their weapons were professional grade, their tactical vests and positioning suggesting actual military or police background. 15 seconds! The megaphone voice boomed across the water. Mike moved to the helm, keeping low and out of sight. Second Wind's controls had been modified with military-grade systems hidden beneath their civilian appearance. He activated a series of switches that most would have mistaken for standard boat electronics. The cabin's windows, which appeared to be normal marine glass, were actually bulletproof, an expensive but potentially life-saving upgrade he'd insisted on during the restoration. He quickly checked the boat's fuel levels and systems. The IT cartel hadn't damaged anything during their attempted theft, which meant he had full maneuverability. The lake's morning traffic was still minimal, reducing the risk of civilian casualties if things went badly. But the real advantage lay in his intimate knowledge of Lake Cascade's geography. 10 seconds. Mike retrieved a small tablet from another hidden compartment, activating a custom system he'd installed throughout the boat. Several cameras hidden around Second Wind's exterior came to life, giving him a 360-degree view of his surroundings. The cartel boats were perfectly positioned, exactly where he'd want them if he were planning an ambush. 5 seconds. Moving swiftly, Mike deployed several small devices through concealed ports in the boat's hull. To the casual observer, they would appear to be nothing more than bubbles in the water, but these were military-grade sonic disruptors, non-lethal devices designed to disorient and incapacitate targets in marine environments. Another modification that had cost a fortune, but was about to prove its worth. "Time's up. This is your final warning." Mike took a deep breath, settling into the familiar calm that preceded combat. His fingers moved across Second Wind's controls, with practiced efficiency, making minute adjustments to the boat's systems. Everything was in place. Now it was just a matter of timing and execution. The cartel boats began to move closer, their crews raising weapons in preparation for what they assumed would be a straightforward assault. They still believed they were dealing with a civilian who had somehow gotten lucky against their advance team. That misconception was about to cost them dearly. Through his camera system, Mike watched as they approached from both sides, their formation perfect for standard cartel intimidation tactics, but vulnerable to what he had planned. Their boats were expensive, powerful vessels equipped for speed and smuggling operations, but speed wouldn't help them in the next few minutes. Mike's hand moved to a custom panel he'd installed beneath the helm. 20 years of special operations had taught him the value of having options, and he'd built second wind with enough of them to handle almost any situation. The cartel was about to learn that they hadn't just stumbled onto any retired veteran's boat. They'd walked into a floating tactical platform, designed by someone who'd spent his career planning for worst-case scenarios. The morning sun now hung fully above the eastern mountains, its glare reflecting off the lake's surface. The conditions were perfect for what Mike had in mind. He could hear the cartel boat's engines growling as they closed the distance, their crews probably already anticipating an easy victory. They had the numbers, the firepower, and the tactical position, everything that would normally guarantee success in this type of operation. But as Mike made his final preparations, a slight smile crossed his face. Normal had stopped applying the moment they'd chosen his boat as their target. The cartel was operating on the assumption that superior numbers and firepower would guarantee their success. They were about to learn that in the hands of someone with enough training and experience, even a fishing boat could become a weapon. The cartel boats were less than 30 yards out when Mike initiated his plan. With practiced precision, he activated the sonic disruptors he'd deployed moments earlier. The devices came to life, sending concentrated waves of sound through the water. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed to happen, but the effect on the cartel boats was immediate and devastating. The high-frequency pulses transmitted through their hulls, creating an intense disorientation among their crews. Mike watched through his camera system as the cartel members staggered, their coordinated approach dissolving into chaos. Several men dropped their weapons, clutching their heads as the sonic assault overwhelmed their equilibrium. The boat's drivers struggled to maintain control as their own sense of balance betrayed them. "What's happening?" one of the commanders shouted in Spanish, his voice betraying panic as his trained soldiers fell into disarray. The boats began to drift erratically, their precise flanking formation broken by crews no longer able to maintain their positions. Mike seized the moment, activating Second Wind's modified engine. The seemingly ordinary fishing boat surged forward with surprising speed, the powerful motor he'd installed during its restoration, revealing its true capabilities. He spun the wheel hard to port, executing a maneuver that would have been impossible for a normal vessel of this size. The cartel boats, their crews still reeling from the sonic attack, couldn't react in time. Mike positioned Second Wind perfectly between them, using his boat's bulk to force them apart. The wake from his sudden acceleration rocked the smaller vessels, further disorienting their already struggling crews. Through his tactical vest, Mike could feel the familiar weight of his Sig Sauer, but he chose not to draw it yet. 20 years of special operations had taught him that the best victories often came without firing a shot. The sonic disruptors were doing their job, incapacitating the cartel members without causing permanent damage. From his port camera, Mike watched as one of the cartel boats attempted to recover, its driver fighting through the disorientation to bring his vessel around for an attack run, but the man's movements were sluggish, impaired by the continuing sonic assault. His attempt to ram Second Wind's hull resulted in a clumsy turn that nearly capsized his own boat. The commander of the operation, visible now through Mike's starboard camera, was shouting frantically into a radio. His trained soldiers, so confident moments ago, were now reduced to stumbling, disoriented masses. Some had fallen to their knees, others were hanging desperately to their boat's railings as the sonic pulses continued to assault their senses. Mike executed another tight turn, positioning Second Wind to take advantage of the morning sun. The glare off the water, combined with the disorientation from the sonic devices, made it almost impossible for the cartel members to get a clear shot at his boat. Those who managed to raise their weapons found their aim severely compromised. "Fall back." The commander's order came too late. Mike had already begun the next phase of his counterattack. He activated Second Wind's water cannon system, another hidden modification that now revealed its worth. Powerful jets of water erupted from concealed ports along his boat's hull, striking the cartel vessels with precise high-pressure streams. The effect was devastating. Already struggling with the sonic assault, the cartel members had no defense against the powerful water jets. Several were knocked off their feet, weapons washed from their hands by the intense pressure. The boats themselves began to take on water, their crews no longer able to maintain their positions or operate their vessels effectively. Through it all, Mike maintained absolute control of his boat, years of maritime operations evident in every movement. He maneuvered second wind in a complex pattern that kept the cartel boats separated, preventing them from supporting each other, while maximizing the effect of his defensive systems. "Diablo!" one of the cartel members screamed, his cry carrying across the water. "He's not human." Mike allowed himself a grim smile as he watched the cartel's coordinated assault dissolve into panic. These men had come expecting an easy target, thinking superior numbers and firepower would guarantee their success. Instead, they'd found themselves facing an opponent who had turned their own confidence against them. The cartel boats were in full retreat now, their crews abandoning any pretense of attack as they struggled to escape the combination of sonic and water assaults. Their engines roared as they attempted to power away from second wind, but their movements were erratic, uncoordinated. Mike maintained pursuit, not to attack, but to ensure they understood the full magnitude of their mistake. As the cartel boats disappeared into the distance, their retreat marked by stumbling crews and waterlogged equipment, Mike finally powered down his defense systems. The morning sun shone on Lake Cascade's now turbulent surface, the piece of earlier shattered but his point made abundantly clear. The cartel had learned a costly lesson about judging targets by appearances, and about the danger of threatening a retired Navy SEAL in his own element. The morning's victory had been decisive, but Mike knew better than to celebrate too early. 20 years of special operations had taught him that initial successes often led to more significant challenges. As he guided second wind back to its mooring, his trained eyes constantly scanned the horizon while his mind processed the tactical situation. The 4 original cartel members were still secured below deck, unconscious, but alive. The radio he'd confiscated from them crackled with increasingly angry Spanish voices. The cartel's leadership was not taking their defeat lightly. Mike listened carefully as he maneuvered his boat, his extensive language training allowing him to pick up crucial details from their communications. "They're bringing in El Coyote," one voice reported, the fear evident even through the static. The other cartel members fell silent at the mention of this name, and Mike's jaw tightened. He knew that call sign from his active duty days. Santiago, El Coyote Ramirez, a former Mexican Special Forces operator who had gone rogue, taking his elite training to the cartels. This wasn't just an escalation, it was a change in the entire game. Mike's mind raced as he processed this new information. El Coyote was known for his ruthless efficiency and his ability to turn seemingly impossible situations to his advantage. During Mike's last year of active duty, he'd been part of a task force trying to capture the man, but El Coyote had always managed to stay one step ahead. Now, ironically, their paths would cross again. Through his boat's camera system, Mike spotted a black helicopter appearing over the mountains to the south. It was flying low, using the terrain to avoid radar detection, a typical El Coyote tactic. The cartel was done playing games. They were bringing in their elite operator to handle what had become an embarrassing situation. Mike quickly accessed another hidden compartment in his boat, retrieving a satellite phone that wasn't registered to any civilian network. He had contacts from his service days who needed to know about El Coyote's presence in U.S. territory, but making that call would take time he didn't currently have. The helicopter was approaching rapidly, its sleek profile suggesting military-grade modifications. The radio intercepted another transmission. El Coyote wants the lake cleared. All civilian boats are to be removed immediately. Mike watched as several high-powered speedboats began approaching other vessels on the lake, their crews directing everyone toward the shore. They were isolating him, eliminating potential witnesses and civilian casualties, another signature El Coyote tactic. Mike's tactical assessment shifted. His boat's defensive systems had worked well against standard cartel operators, but El Coyote would be prepared for such tricks. The man had access to military-grade countermeasures and the knowledge to use them effectively. This was no longer about defending his boat. It was about surviving an encounter with one of the most dangerous men he'd ever hunted. The helicopter circled once, maintaining its distance. Through high-powered optics, Mike could see El Coyote himself in the side door. A lean, scarred man whose very posture spoke of lethal capability. He was surveying the situation, probably already formulating plans to counter everything he'd heard about the morning's events. "Harrison!" El Coyote's voice boomed across the water, amplified by the helicopter's systems. "I thought I recognized your style. Panama, 2019. You almost had me in that mountain pass." Mike maintained his position, his hands steady on second wind's controls. The mention of Panama confirmed his worst fears. El Coyote had recognized his tactics from their previous encounter. This wasn't just about a stolen boat anymore. It had become personal. "You've caused quite a problem for my organization," El Coyote continued, his accent crisp and precise. "4 men in custody, 2 boats disabled, and a significant operation compromised. Very impressive for a retired SEAL." Around the lake's perimeter, Mike could see more cartel vehicles arriving. El Coyote was establishing a complete containment perimeter, cutting off all possible escape routes. The morning sun now hung high in the sky, eliminating the advantage of shadows and limited visibility that Mike had used earlier. "We can handle this professionally," El Coyote offered, his tone almost cordial. "You release my men, surrender your boat, and we part ways. No revenge, no pursuit. You have my word as a former operator." Mike knew better than to trust such offers. El Coyote's professional courtesy was as legendary as his brutality. He would honor his word right up until the moment it became inconvenient. The cartel's reputation was at stake now, and they couldn't afford to let this incident go unanswered. The tactical situation had become exponentially more complex. Second Wind's defensive systems were formidable, but El Coyote would have countermeasures for everything Mike had already revealed. The sonic disruptors, the water cannons, all of them would be expected now. He needed a new strategy, something that even a man of El Coyote's experience wouldn't anticipate. The helicopter maintained its holding pattern as more cartel forces arrived. Mike could see El Coyote speaking into a radio, probably coordinating with his ground teams. The man's reputation for thoroughness was well earned. He would ensure every angle was covered, every potential escape route blocked before making his move. The morning had evolved into a deadly chess match between 2 seasoned operators. Mike watched through his camera system as El Coyote's forces took up strategic positions around Lake Cascade. The helicopter maintained its position, giving the cartel commander a perfect aerial view of the situation. But Mike wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. "Your reputation precedes you, Harrison." El Coyote's voice carried across the water. "Panama was impressive, but I've studied your tactics since then. Your boat's modifications are clever, but they won't save you this time." Mike's mind raced through his options. El Coyote was right about one thing. He couldn't rely on the EI same tricks that had worked against the regular cartel forces. But Second Wind had other secrets, modifications he'd never had to use before, systems that even his closest friends didn't know about. The helicopter suddenly banked hard, dropping closer to the water's surface. Mike recognized the maneuver. El Coyote was positioning his forces for a coordinated assault. 3 more cartel boats had appeared, these ones equipped with military-grade hardware. Their crews moved with the precision of trained operators, not common cartel thugs. "Last chance, Harrison," El Coyote called out. "Surrender now, and we handle this professionally. Fight, and I can't guarantee the safety of any civilians still on the lake." Mike's response came in the form of action. He engaged Second Wind's deepest secret, a proprietary system he'd developed during his final years of service. The boat's ordinary fishing equipment suddenly transformed, panels sliding away to reveal an array of sophisticated electronic warfare devices. El Coyote's helicopter was the first to feel the effect. Its control systems flickered as Mike's electronic countermeasures came online, creating a bubble of interference that played havoc with their sophisticated equipment. The helicopter lurched, forcing the pilot to pull back to a safer distance. "Impressive." El Coyote's voice carried a note of genuine appreciation. "Electronic warfare on a fishing boat. You always were full of surprises." But El Coyote hadn't survived this long by being unprepared. The cartel boats began moving in a complex pattern, their crews deploying countermeasures of their own. They had come equipped for a serious fight, and they meant to finish it. Mike guided Second Wind into deeper water, his hands steady on the controls. The boat's powerful engine hummed as he executed a series of precise maneuvers, positioning himself where the lake's depth would give him the most tactical advantages. His sonar system, far more sophisticated than any civilian equipment, showed him exactly what lay beneath the surface. The first attack came from the water. Cartel divers, deployed from the flanking boats, attempted to approach second wind from below, but Mike's sonar had already picked them up, and he activated his boat's subsurface defense grid. Powerful underwater lights suddenly illuminated the depths, while focused sound pulses drove the divers back, disrupting their equilibrium. El Coyote's helicopter circled wider, trying to find a position where Mike's electronic warfare wouldn't affect their systems. The cartel boats moved in concert, attempting to box second wind into a smaller area of operation. It was a solid tactical approach, one that would have worked against most opponents. But Mike had spent years preparing for scenarios just like this. He engaged second wind's secondary systems, and suddenly the boat's apparent size on radar began to fluctuate. The electronic signature splintered and multiplied, creating ghost images that made it impossible for El Coyote's forces to get a lock on his true position. "Still playing with shadows, Harrison?" El Coyote's voice carried a hint of frustration. "Ow. You can't keep this up forever. My men have the lake surrounded." Mike allowed himself a grim smile as he activated the next phase of his defense. Second wind's hull plates shifted slightly, revealing hidden ports along the waterline. To anyone watching, it would appear that the boat was taking on water, starting to sink into the lake. El Coyote took the bait. "He's going down! Move in and secure the vessel!" The cartel boats surged forward, their crews preparing for a quick capture of what they thought was a failing vessel. It was exactly what Mike had planned for. As they closed in, he triggered second wind's final surprise. A massive electromagnetic pulse focused through the hull ports. The pulse wasn't strong enough to permanently damage equipment, but it created a momentary disruption in every electronic system within range. The cartel boat's engines sputtered and died, their sophisticated weapon systems going dark. Even El Coyote's helicopter was forced to pull back, its instruments temporarily scrambled by the electromagnetic interference. In that moment of chaos, Mike made his move. Second wind's engine, specially shielded against the pulse, roared to life. He executed a perfect high-speed turn, using his opponent's temporary blindness to slip between their stalled vessels. His boat's wake rocked the disabled cartel vessels, further disorienting their crews as they struggled to restart their engines. The electromagnetic pulse had created the perfect chaos across Lake Cascade. As second wind cut through the water, with precision, Mike could see El Coyote's carefully coordinated attack falling apart. The cartel boats drifted helplessly, their crews scrambling to restart dead engines while their sophisticated weapon systems remained offline. But Mike knew this advantage wouldn't last long. El Coyote hadn't become legendary by being easily defeated. "Clever, Harrison." El Coyote's voice crackled through the partially recovered radio. "Using our own technology against us. But you've shown your hand now, and I'm done playing games." The helicopter had recovered first, its higher altitude having partially shielded it from the pulse's full effect. Mike watched through his tactical display as it swooped lower, El Coyote himself visible in the side door. The cartel commander had switched to a shoulder-mounted weapon, something military-grade that even Mike's modified hull might not be able to withstand. "You know what this is, don't you, Harrison?" El Coyote called out. "Swedish AT-4, not much hull plating, can stand up to it. Even your clever modifications." Mike's mind raced through scenarios. The AT-4 was indeed a serious threat, an anti-tank weapon that could tear through second wind's reinforced hull like paper. But using such a weapon would escalate this beyond a simple cartel operation. The sound would carry for miles, attracting exactly the kind of attention El Coyote usually worked to avoid. "Think about what you're doing," Mike responded, finally breaking his silence. "That kind of weapon will bring every law enforcement agency within 100 miles. Is that what you want? Over a fishing boat?" El Coyote's laugh carried across the water. "This stopped being about the boat the moment I recognized your handiwork. This is about reputation now. The cartel can't afford to let someone humiliate them like this." The cartel boats were beginning to recover, their engines sputtering back to life one by one. Mike noticed their crews had switched to backup systems, simpler, less sophisticated, equipment that was more resistant to electromagnetic interference. They were adapting, just as he'd expected them to. But Mike had one more card to play. During his years of service, he'd learned that the best victories often came from making your opponent defeat themselves. El Coyote's pride was his weakness, his need to win personally, to prove his superiority over a former adversary. "You're right," Mike called back, his voice steady. "This isn't about the boat anymore. It's about you and me. Panama wasn't an accident. I let you escape." The words had their intended effect. Mike could see El Coyote's posture stiffen even at this distance. The cartel commander's reputation for invincibility was a crucial part of his mystique. The suggestion that his greatest escape had been allowed rather than earned would be intolerable. "You're lying," El Coyote snarled, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "Am I?" Mike kept his tone casual as he maneuvered second wind in a wide arc. "Check your records. Look at the satellite footage. You'll see I had a clear shot at your vehicle before you reached the border. I held back because taking you out wasn't part of our mission parameters." The helicopter's flight pattern became more aggressive as El Coyote's fury grew. He was losing his tactical focus. Exactly as Mike had intended. The cartel boats, nearly recovered now, were holding position instead of advancing, their crews waiting to see how this personal confrontation would play out. "I should kill you for that alone." El Coyote raised the AT-4, but his usual steady aim was compromised by anger. "You could try," Mike replied calmly, "but then you'll never know for sure, will you? Never know if you really escaped on your own skills, or if I've been letting you run free all these years." The psychological warfare was working. El Coyote's legendary composure was cracking, his tactical judgment clouded by wounded pride. The helicopter's erratic movement showed his growing agitation, making it impossible for him to get a clean shot with the AT-4. Mike used this moment of distraction to implement the final phase of his plan. Second Wind's navigation system had been plotting a precise course throughout the entire confrontation, and now the boat was perfectly positioned. With a series of quick commands, he activated his last surprise, a system that would end this standoff decisively. Hidden underwater speakers, installed during Second Wind's restoration, suddenly erupted with a specific frequency of sound. This wasn't the simple disorientation of his earlier sonic defense. This was a precisely calibrated pulse, designed to interfere with helicopter rotor harmonics, a technology he'd helped develop during his final years of service. The effect was immediate. The helicopter's rotor pattern destabilized, forcing the pilot to pull away or risk losing control completely. El Coyote, caught off guard by the sudden movement, lost his grip on the AT-4. The weapon tumbled into the lake, disappearing beneath the surface before he could recover it. "Fall back!" El Coyote's order carried both rage and resignation. "Fall back now! This isn't over, Harrison!" Mike watched as the helicopter retreated, followed by the cartel boats. He had won this round, not through superior firepower or advanced technology, but by understanding his opponent's psychology and using it against him. El Coyote's reputation had taken a hit that no amount of future violence could easily repair, and they both knew it. As the sound of retreating helicopters and boats faded into the distance, Lake Cascade slowly began to return to its natural state of tranquility. Mike guided Second Wind back to its mooring, his trained eyes still scanning the horizon for any signs of lingering threats. The morning's events had transformed the peaceful lake into a battlefield, but now, in the warm light of the afternoon sun, it was time to restore order. The 4 original cartel members were still secured below deck, their unconscious forms a reminder of how this day had begun. Mike contacted local law enforcement using his satellite phone, carefully crafting his report to protect certain details about his boat's modifications. Within an hour, sheriff's deputies and state police had arrived, their boats surrounding Second Wind as they processed the scene and took the cartel members into custody. "Mind telling me exactly what happened here?" Sheriff Thompson asked, his weathered face showing both concern and admiration as he surveyed the aftermath. The lake's surface was still disturbed where the cartel boats had been disabled, and debris from the confrontation dotted the water. Mike provided a simplified version of events, emphasizing the attempted theft while downplaying the more classified aspects of his response. They picked the wrong boat to steal, he concluded, watching as deputies collected evidence from his deck. I don't think they'll be back. The sheriff nodded slowly, his experience telling him there was more to the story than he was hearing. El Coyote, he said quietly, looking directly at Mike. We've had intel about his operations moving into the area. This isn't just about a boat theft, is it? Mike met his gaze steadily. The lake should be quieter now, he replied. Some reputations don't survive being challenged. El Coyote's organization will find easier routes for their operations. As law enforcement completed their work, other boats began returning to the lake. The local community had witnessed parts of the confrontation from shore, and word spread quickly about how the quiet fishermen they'd barely noticed had single-handedly defended the lake from cartel intrusion. Mike found himself the recipient of grateful nods and respectful distances, the kind of recognition that acknowledged his service without intruding on his privacy. In the days that followed, Mike worked on restoring Second Wind to its pre-battle condition. The boat had performed perfectly, but some of its modifications needed recalibration after such intensive use. As he worked, he reflected on how his peaceful retirement had been temporarily interrupted by echoes of his former life. The lake's regular inhabitants adapted to his presence in a new way. The other boat owners, who had previously seen him as just another retiree, now understood that their waters were protected by someone with unique capabilities. They didn't know the details of his service or the full extent of what had transpired, but they recognized that his presence made their community safer. A week after the incident, Mike sat in his usual spot on Second Wind's deck, fishing rod in hand as the morning sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. The lake's surface was calm, showing no signs of the recent conflict. His satellite phone had brought word that El Coyote's operation had indeed relocated, choosing to avoid any route that might bring them near Lake Cascade. The 4 captured cartel members had provided valuable intelligence to authorities, leading to several significant arrests in the region. The cartel's attempt to establish new smuggling routes through the area's waterways had been thoroughly disrupted. Sometimes, Mike mused, the best victories came not from the battle itself, but from its lasting consequences. Local fishing guide Tom Baker pulled his boat alongside, maintaining a respectful distance. "Morning, Mike," he called out. "Fish biting. Today?" Mike smiled, appreciating the normalcy of the question. "Just getting started," he replied, casting his line into the quiet waters. "Looks like it'll be a good day." Tom nodded, understanding in his eyes. "You know, we never really knew what we had here," he said carefully. "A guardian watching over our lake. The community wants you to know. You'll always have a home. Here." Mike acknowledged the words with a slight nod, his attention seemingly focused on his fishing line. The truth was, Lake Cascade had become more than just a retreat for him. It was a sanctuary he had fought to protect, a place where his past and present had merged to create something worth defending. As the morning progressed, more boats ventured out onto the lake. Children waved from passing vessels, their parents, offering quiet thanks with respectful gestures. The water's surface occasionally rippled with jumping fish, and birds called from the shoreline. Everything had returned to normal, but it was a normal now tinged with understanding that sometimes the most unassuming people carried the greatest capabilities. Mike checked his sonar, noting a school of fish passing beneath his boat. Second Wind had returned to its peaceful purpose, its hidden capabilities once again dormant, but ready if ever needed. The morning's silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of waves against the hull and the distant call of eagles. The lake had taught him something valuable, that retirement didn't mean surrendering who you were or what you could do. It meant finding new ways to use your skills, protecting what mattered in different ways. As he cast his line again into the calm waters, Mike knew that he had found exactly where he belonged, a guardian of peaceful waters, ready, but hoping his special skills would never again be needed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.